thank you so much for being here for this discussion. It's been a long and kind of action-packed and information-packed day, so I'm really glad that everyone here has managed to stick it out, and thank you for being with us here this afternoon. Before diving in, I also want to thank the organizers of this event. The team, Courtney and all of her colleagues have really done a great job of organizing this. Can't thank them enough. They've done it very professionally and very smoothly. And I also, more broadly, want to thank the organizers because I think there's something really novel at this intersection of kind of capital allocation and charity, that this is obviously a pilot effort to explore that. But I hope we see kind of more of it and building out the idea more. There's definitely kind of something there, something novel, and I think something very fruitful for a lot of NGOs. And then lastly, I want to thank our speakers, Petra and Nate. All Hands and Hearts is an organization that I know well, an organization that I work with. The Juicer International Foundation is a supporter of theirs. So just being very open, full disclosure. But we're supporters of theirs because we think they do tremendous work and have for many years. But first, by way of a question, I just want to ask you both, for people who are not familiar with the organization and what you do and where you do it, could you take a couple minutes to spell that out for us?
Sure. So at its core, All Hands and Hearts helps communities respond after disasters and humanitarian crises, and with a particular focus as well of getting children back into school. So what does this mean? Disasters hit, we respond immediately. We like to say we are arriving early, but we also stay late. So we help communities recover for the long term. So rebuild in a lot of different ways, depending on what the disaster may be. And then also getting children back into school, which is really a core tenet of the organization over the last 20 years, because it is so important for communities to be able to recover. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, but that's sort of at its core what we do.
Great. Petra, obviously you founded this organization after the 2004 tsunami, and I think you recognized at that point kind of a key gap, or an intervention gap of sorts, which is that there's a period after the media attention fades with respect to a humanitarian crisis, but communities are still struggling to recover and broken. And I wonder if you could share kind of your experience and how you observed that and kind of how you came to this, I think, really important insight when it comes to humanitarian relief.
Thank you so much, Eric, and thank you to everybody for being here. It was not the lived-in experience of surviving tsunami which made me realize that, but the tsunami experience made me understand the power of nature, how much destruction it creates and how much suffering it creates. What was the important part is when I went back, after being able to walk again, all I wanted to do, still not knowing if I will be able to recover, I wanted to go back to help those who lost everything. Their loved ones, sometimes 11 members of their family, their homes, schools, livelihoods. And I felt, even if I lost my partner and I had pelvis broken in 4 places, I felt so lucky because I could go home and I could go to my family members. And what was important to learn about this gap is to go back and listen to the community members. We visited many shelters, families who lost everything, listened to them. We visited orphanages, listened to them. And one of the recurring worries of everyone was, what are we gonna do with our children? We need them to go back to school so they can have stability. And parents can start rebuilding their lives. And also, of course, when children go back to school, they can start healing from the trauma. And the longer it takes for children to go to school, the trauma goes deeper and deeper. And I did research about what's the usual thing which happens after natural disasters. What's the pattern? When first responders are leaving, it's usually 2-3 months. In the case of the tsunami, it was a little bit longer because it was the biggest natural disaster of our lifetime. 250,000 people lost their lives that day. So they stayed a little bit longer, but when we were back there, which was about 4 months later, they were leaving. And for me, it was unacceptable what I've learned that children have to wait for 2 years, 4 years, 6 years, 10 years to have their school rebuilt. Sometimes they never get rebuilt. And to me, it was unacceptable that children who suffered so much and went through, seen a lot of things that children shouldn't see, they had to continue suffering for years to come. And many schools don't get even rebuilt. And the important part is if children are saved from a rubble or a tsunami and they're on the streets, they're not really saved. So to me, I had to take action, and I knew that because it was a recurring pattern, there must be a solution, and that's how everything started, to focusing on that gap period when first responders are leaving, and to fill that gap with school, which is not really just a building. It provides safety, it provides a brighter future, but on so many levels. The ripple effects are on children, on family, on the community, on economy. It's massive.
I think that's, I think it's really crucial, and I know the three of us have all worked in kind of areas where there's either been a natural disaster or a conflict or, you know, a profound disruption of society. And I think it's worth noting that it's the first person experience of that context that often is the only way you understand that. I think when so much of our experience is intermediated either by the internet or by other forms of media, and I think it's really hard to get that human connection that makes you understand something that I think, thanks to you, has become, it's now understood that it's not merely enough to go in to respond to the first crisis and then move out. And so I think that really speaks to kind of your depth of involvement in it. Now I'm curious, both of you worked together in Haiti, in Ukraine, and Nate, you're now the All Hands and Hearts CEO. And I'm curious from both of your perspectives that in order to kind of scale up the work that All Hands and Hearts is doing and that other organizations are doing after natural disasters, what's the role that partnerships play in that with local organizations or other organizations? I'm really curious to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah, you know, partnerships is actually how, you know, Petra and I connected and then reconnected again. You know, we crossed paths a long time ago when I was working very closely with a chef named Jose Andres, and we built an organization called World Central Kitchen, and that sort of had its roots in Haiti, and Petra was there rebuilding schools, and All Hands and Hearts, I didn't mention this, All Hands and Hearts has now built 380 schools around the world. And so we knew about the incredible work that Petra and her team were doing, and then over the years, as I was running World Central Kitchen, we had an opportunity for our teams to collaborate in places like Indonesia and the Bahamas and Puerto Rico. A lot of times it was the All Hands and Hearts team that was in our kitchen helping us cook meals and prepare meals, and they were mobilizing, you know, hundreds of volunteers and doing this incredible work. And Ukraine kind of brought everything full circle again. You know, I went into Ukraine very early on, and today is actually the 4th anniversary of the full-scale invasion, which is just kind of mind-boggling that we're still, you know, here. Something that I would have never imagined 4 years ago. But you know, Petra and the All Hands and Hearts team at the time was doing incredible work, helping children get away from the frontline areas and rescuing children under occupation and bringing them to safety, working with an incredible organization called Save Ukraine. And obviously I was there with World Central Kitchen, and we were serving all meals. And so we were like, you know, kind of in these circles, like working right next to each other. And I was seeing the work that she was doing, and we were collaborating, and that kind of brought everything kind of back together again. And I think it's a perfect example of how, you know, we need all of us participating. Obviously the NGOs to be working together. Too often, unfortunately, in this world, you know, nonprofits are very competitive, right? Because we're like fighting over the same dollars, or we think there's like this limited amount of money out there, even though, as Scott Harrison mentioned earlier, you know, there are $1 trillion in DAF sitting there, but you know, we're sort of fighting over the scraps of the money, and unfortunately that tends to be the mindset of this like zero-sum game. And what I love about All Hands and Hearts is it's actually, you know, it sort of came into its current form as a merger between two independent nonprofits, and sort of an M&A in the nonprofit space, which you don't really hear about a lot. But obviously being at a conference, you know, a finance conference, something that's very common. But I think that's such an important frame because it is so important for all of us to work together, but not just in the nonprofit space, but bringing in the private sector, bringing in the philanthropists and the family offices and the foundations, because everybody really needs to play a role. And those folks who want to support the work should also be able, as Petra was saying, to come see it and to be on the ground, and I think we're at a place now where this is really where the future is and where we're headed. It's not just this bad thing happens, we're going to write a check to some institutional organization and they're going to solve the problem. It's like, how do we all come together and do it?
I want to pick up on that strand in a second, but I want to ask you, you mentioned private sector actors. We're obviously in the midst of a larger meeting that has a profound private sector component. Can you give me an example of where you've worked with a private sector actor you think, gosh, they did a really good job, or we had a really good experience collaborating with them?
Yeah, I mean, all the time, and Petra, feel free to jump in, but I mean, in all of our programs, all the work that we do, we partner very closely with the private sector, and this can be through organizations that are supporting us financially, institutions like Jeffries that stepped up after the Maui fires and the LA wildfires to support the work. And recently we just had a team from Travelers Insurance come down to our program in North Carolina, where we're a year and a half after the hurricane, we're still rebuilding homes. We've now worked on, All Hands and Hearts has worked on about 270,000 homes around the world. And so they bring, that's one aspect, is they can come down and get hands-on. So support financially, get very hands-on with the work. But also, I think it's very important that, we, in the communities in which we work, it's not just about, hey, we're coming in and parachuting in and we're gonna solve the problems, right? We have to uplift those communities, whether that's here in the United States, where we are hiring locally, partnering with local businesses, supporting the local community in that moment through the private sector work, or internationally, where we have training programs where we hire locally as well, but we also train, for example, we have a female Mason training program for when we're building schools. And in places like Nepal and the Philippines and Mexico, where those women who have now, they become Masons through our program and can go work in the industry ongoing. And so I think keeping that mindset as part of it, even though we are a nonprofit, is very important component, because we don't kind of operate in an isolated bubble.
I'd love to ask you,
perhaps
go ahead,
just
Pat.
one other interesting partnership with BlackRock. They've been coming and they've been raising funds for schools for many years with us, and not just raising funds, they come, so regionally, BlackRock Asia, they do a competition, and those who win, they get to actually travel to Nepal and volunteer and do the hard work of building a school. And this program has been so successful because it's many times for the first time they actually meet because they are in different countries and they don't get a chance to work together in the same room. So it's been such a successful program, and for us as an organization, it's been crucial. Because, for example, in Nepal, the earthquake was in 2015, and we are still rebuilding there. So more than 10 years later, the needs are tremendous, and you don't hear about it, and about Nepal at all. Yet there has been over 8,000 schools damaged. And then further you go away from the capital, less people have interest to come and help and rebuild. And we are working now often 10 hours away from the capital. So having this long-term commitment from BlackRock to support us every year has been incredibly helpful for us, because we can plan ahead, that we can come back to Nepal and keep building schools.
Petra, picking up on that, and also you mentioned earlier the kind of journey you went through to understand that, recovery from the disaster is a long-time process. It doesn't go away when the first responders leave. How have you been able to, or have you been, or is it successful, or what do you tell funders to get them to think not about disasters as kind of a one-time emergency, but as a multi-year recovery and resilience effort?
Well, two important points already mentioned, but I will elaborate on it. when you really save a child from a rubble, you didn't truly save that child, because they are on the streets exposed to all kinds of dangers, from labor to abuse to trafficking, and so they're not truly safe. Second, the majority of the funding after disasters comes in the next few weeks, so 2-3 weeks. That's where you have the majority of funding coming in. Yet, and then later, there's perhaps some bigger foundations, they give some funding for rebuilding. Yet the cost of rebuilding is 10 to 20 times higher than the cost which happens during the first response phase. So the arc is completely upside down. And it's very hard to raise money 10 years later after earthquake, or even 2 years later, or even a year later. So the attention is on the disaster, 2-3 weeks, and that's the window we have to raise money for the next few years. And it's a very short window. And so for donors who want to be very smart about giving, what I would suggest, if you want to make really sustained impact, either select a charity which does both first response and rebuilding, and they do the full arc. There are a few of them. We do that, but there are a few others as well. Or if you have $10,000, put part of the funds to charities which do first response, and part of the funds to charities which do rebuilding. That way, the communities can go back on their legs faster. Because if there's some support and then it drops, those communities cannot recover. You know, if you imagine 8,000 schools in Nepal, that's already very poor country. They don't have the means to recover. So that means that children are studying for 4 years later, 6 years later, in a makeshift schools. That means metal sheets, two walls of metal sheets, third one, fourth one missing, with the rain coming in, and that's their classroom. And so that's how they're staying, or in classrooms of the old school which are unsafe. If it continues for 6 years, you lose the whole generation.
So given what you just mentioned, you've basically said one of the lessons I take away from this is that when it comes to an issue of responding to disaster or conflict, we're always talking about the value of patient capital, but it's exquisitely necessary in contexts like this. And that anyone who is understandably responding to kind of a very human response to images they see on TV or on the internet or elsewhere, really should also begin to train themselves not only to be generous in that moment about the near term, but also to think kind of, I think, in the long term. And I think that's something that's it's actually not first nature for human beings, so it's really a challenge.
And it doesn't get magically solved.
Yeah,
you know,
yeah.
It's just.
I definitely think that's the case. And I think just flagging something that, I mean, there are a lot of engaged philanthropists out here that should be thinking about, when they think about kind of where their capital might go in the future. You know, Nate and I were just talking backstage about how in places like Ukraine and Gaza, we have eventually a moment that's coming up post-conflict. There will be a post-conflict period where the needs will be huge. And so I think it's one of these things to just think of the world as a series of challenges that are not over and not just solved like that. But again, that organizations like All Hands and Hearts are thinking in this long-term strategic mindset. Speaking of kind of the future of disaster recovery, I'm curious to know that, you know, what would you say to a donor that has not been active in this space, in addition to all the eloquent things you both have said? What, you know, whether they're distilled lessons learned or points of serious high impact in terms of their giving, how would you counsel a donor that's new to this space?
I would say that there are two very impactful ways to have really massive impact. One, in the immediate days of the disaster, acting super fast without red tapes, without bureaucracy. That's when it can save a huge amount of lives and suffering. And great example is when the war in Ukraine started 4 years ago, today. We called few incredible donors, and they immediately deployed funding to rescue children, orphan children, families with children from combat zones in Ukraine. If they would not act fast enough, those children and families wouldn't be probably alive. So one of the most impactful way is acting fast, and that was Jeffrey's incredible supporters and few other donors. They like to be anonymous, I can't mention them, but they are always there when the crises happen, and they are very rare to find because there's usually process and all that. And then second, supporters who think really long term, and they are dedicated, committed for the long term and finding solutions. And when obstacles arise, they are there with you and they work with you and to find those solutions. And sometimes you get both, like actually some people like Jeffries, they do both. They do the immediate and the long term. Tony Robbins, the same, immediate needs and long term needs. So sometimes you get actually a few incredible supporters who understand that they need to act fast and stay committed. Maybe Nadu.
Yeah, I think we are in a transformational moment right now. We hear that a lot right now. I think talking about AI, but I think geopolitically and the way that we, as a country and as a world, kind of respond to some of these big challenges is changing. Some of that has to do with the challenges are bigger than ever before. Also, the conflicts are going on longer than ever before. And we've seen firsthand here in the United States a real shift of away from government responsibility as well. So USAID, which traditionally would have been the primary vehicle to go and respond to many of the humanitarian crises that are around the world, no longer exists as an agency, right? And that is putting more pressure on nonprofits working in disaster relief and humanitarian response to serve that purpose. Also, it is a moment where we need folks to get off the sidelines as well because of that. I think there's an opportunity here, even amidst a bit of the chaos and the moment that we're in right now, to begin to figure out what comes next. And I think folks who maybe who are interested in supporting or care about these issues, maybe haven't necessarily gotten super involved, this is a moment where I think they can help dictate or help determine kind of and play a part of what comes next. So figuring out, as Petra said, how do we prioritize capital? How do we make it efficient? How do we not just throw it into the ocean of multi-letter agencies and not know what's going to happen to it, right? And I think for nonprofits, it's a moment where they can really show, here's what we can deliver, here's our effectiveness, terms like ROI, things that you would normally hear in finance conferences on the private sector side. I think nonprofits are really starting to embrace, and things like KPIs and all of impact and all of this, that how far is the dollar going? And I think right now it can go farther than ever. And we have a big challenge ahead of us because we have to figure out how to solve some of these major crises around the world without relying on long-term government or institutional support. But it is also a moment where we can kind of determine what comes next and hopefully build a better system, perhaps, than what it was before, with the help of those folks who can kind of come off the sidelines and play a role there and be a part of it.
Can I push you a little bit on that?
Absolutely, please.
Just for the simple reason that when we talk about the sheer volume of capital that has left the scene with USAID and other government sources, and not only the U.S., so this isn't an anti-governmental tirade just yet, but when we think about if I look at the resources available to private philanthropy, yes, they're estimable, but is it and yes, I understand your call to sort of like greater efficiency and belt tightening among NGOs. Many are already wonderfully run.
Yeah.
Is there a disconnect there? I mean, do you think, and is that only a stopgap? If private philanthropy steps up to sort of fill in the gap for a few years, what do you think in the long term, what happens with this sort of transformation of resources that we've had?
Oh, absolutely. I think that private philanthropy will never replace the scale and the scope of what a government can provide, right? However, private philanthropy can serve as a critical catalyst to what comes next. And also looking beyond just, kind of a basic level of we're going to respond to this short-term thing to fix this short-term problem. It can also be thinking about the long term. I think Ukraine is actually a really good example of this. And almost by necessity, Ukraine has shifted the way that it talks about the support that it needs. In the early days of the war, a lot of the discussion was humanitarian support. It was about aid, and it was a big mistake, actually, if I say so, the way that our government framed our support to Ukraine, right? We called it we called it aid for Ukraine. We said it's $60 billion we're going to give to Ukraine, when actually 90% of that money stayed here in the United States, right? But in people's minds, it was, we're giving all this money to Ukraine. And Ukraine realized that it couldn't just, 4 years in, it can't just keep asking for aid. It can't just keep asking for humanitarian support. So then the question is, how does the support that it can receive become catalytic to bring on recovery, investment, private capital for the future, right? I'll give you one just concrete example of this related to the work that we were doing. I spent time before I had the great opportunity to join Petra and All Hands on Arts. I spent a couple of years working in Ukraine with a gentleman named Howard Buffett. And Howard himself, personally, has put in about $1.2 billion into Ukraine himself. And all philanthropic, not investment. But the way that he sees his philanthropic capital is, so the First Lady of Ukraine came to him and said, we need to feed kids in schools. He said, great. So I don't just want to buy the food for the kids and pay for the meals like maybe the World Food Program was doing. Not saying that's an important thing to do. I don't want to, speak poorly of the World Food Program, but Howard said, how do we invest? How do we create the system so that you can feed yourselves moving forward? And so one of the things that we did was we built a central school production kitchen that could serve as a model, so a centralized kitchen that could serve the entire kind of school community. So you wouldn't have to have each school cooking, and which is very complex, and you have to upgrade all these school kitchens. There's a lot of damage because of the war. And then that became a model which then they started to use to attract private capital to come in and say, hey, look, we'll have, if you can help fund or operate, just like we do in the United States, right? We have private companies that run, there's right here in this convention center, there's a private company that runs the food service here, right? Mm-hmm. Most universities, most high schools have private companies that run their food service because that model works. But to get there, you have to catalyze it. And so that's one example, and I think that could be a whole separate discussion in and of itself, but I mention that because I guess I think, yes, we cannot expect private capital to solve and replace what USAID was doing. And we do need, foreign assistance is very valuable in what governments put in. But I do think it is a moment where we are seeing a shift, and we can say, how do we take the nonprofits that know how to do this incredible work, they're on the ground, they know the communities, they spend time, as Petra said, they go back and say, okay, what can we do? How can we be smart about the local partnerships and what we invest in? And I think that's the type of thing that can be transformative in this work.
Thank you, because that's a very thoughtful, very specific, and very optimistic answer. And I really appreciate that, because those of us, again, who've been working in the sector for a long time know it's sometimes hard to find optimism.
To work in the humanitarian space, you have to be a naive optimist. Like you just have to believe that everything's gonna. Otherwise, you just get depressed all the time.
Well, no, but and you gave us a dose of informed optimism. I know we're running out of time, but I just wanted to say thank you to both of you. I also wanted to distill, because I'm a huge lessons learned person, at least distill one tenth of the wisdom that was imparted during this panel by saying, in the case of humanitarian response or natural disasters, act quickly, think for the long term, act for the long term as well, and don't try to catch Nate out with smarty pants questions. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you.